Haggai 1, verse number 1. In the second year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the first day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Josedech the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, The time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Now, I mentioned this last week as well, but it bears repeating just a little bit. We're not going to go over everything again. But the setting for this book is very, very important, because the setting is really the whole reason why Haggai comes to minister at all. And so, again, I know we mentioned all this last week, but just to kind of rehash this a little. Haggai becomes the first prophet to minister to Israel post-exile. So the Jews, and when we say this, we're talking about specifically those of Judah. And so they were captured, taken captive by Babylon. They're there for 70 years. They eventually return, and due to the events of their return, Haggai's ministry becomes very important. And so Cyrus, the king, Cyrus, allowed the Jews and really gave them significant provision, not only to leave Babylon and return to Israel, but to return with the express purpose of rebuilding the temple. And so this was, as we talked about last week, this was nothing but the moving of the hand of God, that a pagan king would allow the Jews to leave his control. Now, I say that. They were still a province of Persia, but they're not under his direct control anymore, and they leave. And not only that, but to be able to rebuild this temple to their God, it was a miraculous thing that was taking place. However, again, as we discussed last week, the work eventually ceased, and there were a couple of reasons why, but none of that is really important right now. The fact is they came and they rebuilt the altar so that they could continue or I guess return to the sacrifices that they used to do. And then they laid the foundation for the new temple, and then they stopped there. For various reasons, the work ceased, and the temple was never built. And so 16 years removed, and then Haggai comes on the scene, and the temple has not been built. And so that's really the important setting for this particular book and for his ministry. And so here we see in verse number 1, and I think we mentioned this last week, Haggai does a really good job of really time-stamping his messages. And so he does this here a few times, but he does it in verse 1. And so in the second year of Darius, in the 6th month, in the first day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai. And he specifically says who's he speaking to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. And so he gives this message on the first day of the month. We'll come back to that. But he gives this message to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. Zerubbabel was the governor of what was now a Persian province of Judah. And so they allow, again, as they allow the Jews to return to rebuild Judah, and they give them a Jewish king, but he is a Jewish king under Persian control. And so again, it was a Persian province, but they did have a certain amount of autonomy. But nevertheless, Zerubbabel was under the hand of Persia. But Zerubbabel, interestingly enough, was a direct descendant of King David. And so you can see that in the chronology of 1 Chronicles chapter 3. And so again, this was in further fulfillment of promises given to David that somebody from his line would always be on the throne. And so they continued to have a Davidic king in the man of Zerubbabel. But what you will see as we go through Haggai, and as you see as we get into Zechariah, is that Zerubbabel and Joshua almost always, there's a couple of times where it's not the case, but almost always are mentioned together. You will see almost always Zerubbabel and Joshua together. And Joshua was now the high priest. He was, again, in accordance with the law, a direct descendant of Aaron. You can see that in 1 Chronicles 6. You can see that in Ezra chapter 3 as well. And so, again, they're keeping in line with who ought to be in these positions of power. But the fact that these two men are almost always mentioned together seems to indicate, now, it's never directly said, but it seems to indicate that the leadership of Judah was now kind of codependent upon the governor. And interestingly enough, it's governor now. It's not king. It's governor because things have changed. It's the governor and the high priest. And so they seem to kind of take a leadership model for the nation, for the new nation of Judah. And so this kind of leads into the time of Christ, where you see the high priest having a great amount of power and prestige. And so this probably started here when the Jews returned. And so you have Zerubbabel, Joshua together, kind of co-reigning, if you will. But what I want you to notice is this message was more for than just these two men. And so it's directly worded to Zerubbabel, directly worded to Joshua. But the timestamp here gives us a new group that this message was for. And so again, he's speaking in the 6th month, and the first day of the month came this message. And so after the return of Judah, the Jews switched from using a Jewish calendar to a Babylonian calendar. And they measured their time slightly different. And most people believe, and I would agree, that the return of the Jews from, or rather the captivity of the Jews into Babylon kind of began that era that Christ spoke about as the times of the Gentiles. And so the switch of the calendar from the Jewish calendar to the Babylonian calendar kind of marked this particular turn. But the fact that they started going off of a Babylonian calendar now meant every new month began with a new moon. And so a new month, the first day of the month, it would be a new moon. This is the way the Babylonians marked their calendar. And so we know that the Israelites had new moon festivals. The book of Numbers gives the laws for this, but they had new moon festivals, and so they had sacrifices that they would have to give for these new moon festivals. And so it is very likely that Haggai, speaking in Jerusalem to Zerubbabel, to Joshua the high priest, but if he's in Jerusalem speaking to the high priest, if he's speaking on the first day of the month, he's speaking to a whole lot more, because there will be a lot of Jews who had come to Jerusalem in order to give the sacrifices for this new moon festival. And so again, it's specifically given to Zerubbabel and Joshua, but it was for everybody. It was for the people, and the message itself, I think, makes that really clear. And so he begins his message by appealing to authority, and this is of vital importance in verse 2. And so verse 2, he says, "Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts." And so he places this message fully and firmly on the authority of God. And again, this is important because you have to remember the people to whom he's speaking. And so his message was not only for two men working under the authority of Persia in a land controlled by Persia, but there was a much greater authority, right? "Thus speaketh the Lord God of hosts." And so the people that he's speaking to have been under the rule of a Babylonian king for decades, and now under the rule of Persia, this people needed to fully understand that worldly powers have no control or authority over the supreme and omnipotent power of God. And so here was Haggai standing in front of this people, fully reminding them that it doesn't matter what Cyrus says, it doesn't matter what the king of Babylon or Persia or any other worldly power says, it matters what thus saith the Lord. This is what matters. And God has given you a command, and you're not following it, and you're allowing the oppression from outside powers to come in and stop you from rebuilding this temple. And as we're going to see, it was an affront to God. And so he started this right by placing this message on the full authority of God on high. And this is exactly what he should have done. And Haggai does this throughout this very small book. It's only 2 chapters long. And only 38 verses. That's all that you see in the book. And only 38 verses, Haggai includes the name Yahweh, which is translated Lord in all capitals if you have the King James there. And so 38 verses, Haggai includes the name Yahweh 35 times. And so what he's doing is he's firmly planting the people back upon this foundation that yes, we have a king, we have Zerubbabel, governor, we have Joshua the high priest, but our foundation and our power is God, right? That this is who rules us. This is who governs us. We may have a human man who's kind of filtering things through the auspices of the high priest. But God is our authority. And so Haggai was doing, I think, a tremendous job. We mentioned this last week, but again, we'll see as we move forward. Haggai is the most successful prophet that Israel ever saw. And we'll see that as we go through this book. And so he's firmly stamping his message based upon the authority of God. And so he says, "This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built." As we already mentioned, 16 years after they began the work, the people still said the time was not right to finish the work. And so again, there was a general apathy that had invaded the people. And it started 16 years prior when there was there was threats, there was threatenings, should they continue this, from some of their enemies. But nevertheless, 16 years removed, that threat is not there anymore, and yet the apathy remained. The apathy that said, you know what, it's just not quite time. Right? There's still other things to do. And so we've got the altar, right? We can still do our sacrifices. That's all we really need. And so, whether or not we get to the temple today, tomorrow, it doesn't really matter. Right? And so this is what I was talking about earlier. This became an affront to God. And so that God was very unhappy with their apathy towards his house is seen in the fact that he says, this people. He does not say my people. This is an unusual thing, and this typically comes up in judgment wording. Not my people, but this people, right? So again, verse 2, this people say the time has not come. If it were my people, you know what they would have done? They would have finished this 16 years ago. But this people says the time's not come. I'll quote J. Alec Moultrie. He said, to refuse to build the Lord's house was at best saying that it did not matter whether the Lord was present with him. At worst, it was presuming on divine grace that the Lord would live with his people even though they willfully refused to fulfill the condition of his indwelling that he had laid down. In other words, yes, God, we want you to be present with us. We want you to dwell with us, but really we want you to do it on our terms. This is what they were saying. Yeah, we want all of you. We want all the good, but we really want it how we want it, not necessarily how you want it. And so how often, and just to bring this to us today, how often are God's people guilty of knowing the right thing to do, but refusing because they just say that the time's just not right. The timing is just off. What is procrastination if not a belief that your timing is better than God's? Now, that's not to say that sometimes waiting is the proper response, right? Sometimes waiting is the proper response. But we've got to understand that procrastination, I think as we see in the text, procrastination breeds apathy. Well, I'll put it off, I'll do it tomorrow, and eventually tomorrow never comes, and eventually it's like, well, it's been so long, what's the point of doing it now? Right? Procrastination breeds apathy. And so over time, the longer we put off something, the less likely we're going to be to do it. And now, as I said, sometimes waiting is the proper response, but there's a difference in patiently waiting and actively avoiding. And what they were doing was actively avoiding doing the thing that God wanted them to do. And for this, God gives them an interesting message. And we're going to come back to verse 3 and 4. But in verse 5, he says, consider your ways. Now, we're going to look at that more next week. But this is God's response to their apathy. But look at verse 3. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house, the house of God, lie waste? Whereas they apparently had apathy towards building the house of God, they apparently had none when it came to building their own homes. Now, I mentioned this last week. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a home. There's nothing wrong with having a nice home. There's nothing wrong with these things in and of themselves. But what they were doing was, again, actively avoiding building the house of God to make sure that they had homes, and as we'll see in just a moment, not just homes, but well-decorated homes, as we'll see. Now, furthermore, this is what I'm talking about. The word sealed there, this is an interesting word. So the word sealed in this verse, for you to dwell in your sealed houses. The word sealed means to cover. That's what the word means. And so it is possible that this just refers to a ceiling or a roof, some kind of top of the homes that they were building. However, of the 6 times this word is used, so it's not used a lot in the Old Testament, of the 6 times this word is used, absolutely 4 of them, at least 4 of them, refer to an ornamental covering. Not just a covering, but an ornamental covering. And that could be 5 if that's what's being referenced here in our text tonight. And so if this is the case, not only did they build a house to protect their family, which again is not a bad thing, but not only did they build a house to protect their family, they spent time and resources elaborately decorating their homes while the temple lie waste. And let's add a little bit more to this. Ezra chapter 3 verse 7 tells us that Cyrus, when he gave them the decree to go back and to rebuild, not only, as we saw last week, not only did he give them the vessels that had been taken out of the original temple, but in chapter 3, verse 7, we actually see that Ezra gave them, that Cyrus gave them a grant to purchase cedar from Lebanon in order to use that cedar to rebuild the temple. And so, again, it seems very likely that one of two things has taken place. Again, here we are 16 years, still no temple. And so it seems likely that one of two things take place. Either they took the grant that Cyrus gave them to purchase cedar, and they used that grant money to build their own homes, or they did purchase the cedar and then use that cedar to build their own homes. And another interesting tidbit, when I told you earlier that the word sealed 4 times evidently and directly refers to ornamental coverings, if I'm not mistaken, almost every time it's used to refer to an ornamental covering, that ornamental covering was made of cedar. And so, again, you put all these things together, and what becomes clear is that not only were they actively avoiding doing what they knew they should have been doing, but they were spending time not just getting a place for their family, a place of protection, but they were lavishly putting money, time, and resources on their own homes, going above and beyond what was the necessity when they were neglecting the work of God. And this is what was happening. And so the attitude of the people is and I think this is a very interesting thing. The attitude of the people in Haggai is literally the exact opposite of the attitude of David when it came to the temple. And so we read in 2 Samuel chapter 7, it says, "And it came to pass when the king," speaking of David, "when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains." And David was moved. He didn't like this. And it stirred up within David. He said, I'm going to build God a house. Now, eventually, we understand that God didn't allow him to do it, and it went to Solomon. It went to his son. But the idea came from David. And the idea came because David was sitting in his home and thinking, this is a waste. I'm sitting here in my home when God's sitting and dwelling in curtains. We should build him something much, much greater. And so, again, we see the exact opposite idea taking place in the book of Haggai. And so what does it tell us? They made their priorities clear. And this is the issue. They made their priorities clear. Hardship, of which we'll see more next week, and just to kind of look ahead, you look at verse 6. He says, you have sown much, you bring in little, you eat, but you have not enough, you drink, but you're not filled with drink, you clothe you, but there is none warm, and he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. And then further down, it says in verse 9, he says, you looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why, saith the Lord of hosts? Because of mine house that is waste. And you and every man to his own house. Verse 11, he says, And I called for a drought upon the land, and upon mountains, upon corn, upon the new wine, upon the oil, upon that which is the ground bringeth forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, upon all labor of thine hands. All of this to say that God was bringing them hardship, specifically because of their neglect of the house of God. And so hardship stopped them from building God's house, but it did not stop them from building their own. Right? And so, again, their priorities were made abundantly clear. And I want to quote Matthew Henry here because I love what he says. He says, note, there is an aptness in us to misinterpret providential discouragements in our duty as if they amounted to a discharge from our duty, when they are only intended for the trial and exercise of our courage and faith. It is bad to neglect our duty, but it is worse to vouch providence for the patronizing of our neglects. In other words, God starts giving them these hardships to open their eyes to the fact that they're lavishly spending all this time and resource on their own homes, while the house of God is nothing. And instead of seeing these hardships as a sign of God to clearly point them in the direction that they ought to be going, it just further pushed them away from doing what they were supposed to be doing. And they used hardship as a sign to say, well, obviously we can't go do this. Look at this. We don't have crops. We don't have money. We don't have all the things we're supposed to have. And yet their homes didn't lie waste, right? Their homes didn't suffer, and it was just the house of God that suffered. And so for those neglects, God gives them this ominous warning that we'll actually see he gives several times throughout the book. In verse 5, consider your ways. Now again, we'll look at that more next week, but I think these verses give us a solid footing to stand on for the rest of this book. And again, we really want to set the setting because it is so vital for our understanding of this. But again, what we can see here is our priorities matter. Now, let me say this while I'm here. I did see several people who tried to make one-to-one correlations, and I don't want to make one-to-one correlations. I saw many people who said, take the story of Haggai and bring it into the modern context. We need to make sure that our places of worship are what they need to be. We can't make a one-to-one correlation here because the temple of God is not the same. The temple of God is now you and I. We are the temple of God. And so if we're going to be spending time making sure the temple of God is what it ought to be, we're not talking about brick and mortar. We're not talking about stone. We're talking about ourselves. And so, again, we don't want to extrapolate that out to make a bad interpretation here. But nevertheless, what it does show us is that we must have our priorities in line. And that when we don't have our priorities in line, suffering and hardship and trial, all of these things can come as a result of our priorities being out of line. And the people of Judah here, they show that to us very, very clearly.